In today's world, it is sometimes easy to forget how difficult it was to survive in the ancient world. Two of the primary causes of death in the ancient world were war and famine. To protect themselves from invaders, ancient kingdoms built high walls around their cities and maintained large standing armies to serve as a deterrent. They also constructed heavily armed forts around their territory to stem the tide of invading forces. Hunger was also a significant threat. Without modern fertilizer or agricultural equipment, farmers were limited in the amount of food they could produce per acre and were often wholly dependent on their yearly harvest for survival. One bad crop or lack of rainfall would often result in deadly famines. Without access to refrigeration, the only solution available to farmers was to plant crops as consistently and often as possible. Any country that did not actively protect itself from invading armies or potential famines faced almost certain destruction. Remarkably, in the Bible we find two commandments that directly contravene these survival necessities. Every seventh year, the Jewish nation was commanded to put down their plows and refrain from planting or harvesting for an entire year. By following this law, the Jews were confronted with a situation where they would potentially be without food for 2 years. Such a law seems like complete suicide, yet in the Bible, God directly addresses this issue. And should you ask, what are we to eat in the seventh year if we may neither sow nor gather in our crops? I will ordain my blessing for you in the 6th year, so that it shall yield a crop sufficient for 3 years. God promises to bless the year from the 6th year, that it will be bountiful enough to live for off its products for 3 years, until the 8th year crops are ready for harvest. What human being can make such a promise? After the first 7-year cycle, either the Jews would die out or survive and face the reality that the Bible's prophecy was a hoax. Yet, for over 800 years, the Jewish kingdom flourished, and there is no recorded resistance to this counterintuitive commandment. If the Bible was human-made, how insane were the authors to put a testable commandment into their text that virtually guarantees that the religion would be doomed after 7 years? This commandment points to divine authorship. The other remarkable commandment is the directive for the entire male population to gather 3 times a year in the nation's capital. Exodus 34:23 states, 3 times during the year shall all your males must appear directly before the Master, the Lord, the God of Israel. Consider this law. The Jewish kingdom was relatively small compared to mighty nations surrounding it. Yet the Bible commands that 3 times a year all men must leave their posts and congregate for several days in Jerusalem. For 3 weeks a year, our borders would be defenseless, and all our property would be ripe for plunder. To quell this concern, God unequivocally promised the Jewish people, "No one will covet your land when you go up to appear before the Lord, your God, 3 times each year." God promised a miracle. 3 times a year, the Jewish men could all leave their post, and no nation would attack their property left behind. For hundreds of years, the entire Jewish nation abandoned their villages and town and left their border undefended because they were secure in God's promise. Consider how foolish a human author would have to be to create a commandment that virtually guaranteed the downfall of one's religious empire. Such a commandment only makes sense if it was given by a divine lawgiver.